There's a great story told of a conversation between a grandfather and his young grandson. And the grandfather was telling this to the little boy. He said, "There are two wolves living in my heart, and they are at war with one another. One is cruel, greedy, and selfish, and the other is wise, kind, and generous." The little boy got frightened when he heard this and said, "Well, Grandpa, which one is going to win?" And the grandfather paused before he responded, and then he said, "The one that I feed." I think if we're honest with ourselves, we all have to admit that each one of us also has those two wolves at war in our hearts. One that's greedy and cruel and selfish, and the other that's wise and kind and generous. And on any given day, one or the other might triumph. Which one do we feed and nourish? That first reading from Sirach tells us that our God sets before us fire and water, life and death, good and evil. He tells us we have choices that we can make, choices that demand the mature wisdom that we hear Paul writing about to the church at Corinth. And then Jesus in the gospel challenges us to our choices about our anger and our righteousness. Which are we feeding? Which are we nourishing? Now, we only need to look around our world to know the problems that exist today, and to realize that so often the greedy, the cruel, the selfish wolf wins. The 2008 financial crisis was caused by choices that were made. The selfish, greedy wolf won. All kinds of corporate mismanagement, heedless risk-taking by Wall Street, shoddy mortgage lending, the excessive packaging and sale of loans to investors, and risky bets on securities backed by loans. There's a new movie coming out called The Company Men. It's all about the financial crisis, and it's about the choices that men made for profit that resulted in the destruction of relationships, the destruction of people. Too many people today do feed the wrong wolf, and we do see disaster all around us. So each one of us is called to stop and reflect on, how do we nourish ourselves? What are we feeding ourselves with? What emotions do we feed? Are we constantly feeding our anger, our resentment, our jealousy? Or are we trying to feed our generosity, our compassion, our forgiveness, our tolerance, our understanding? What kind of nourishment do we provide ourselves with, our marriages with, our families with? Do we have a constant diet of violence on TV and in the movies? It's interesting. University of Michigan professor of social psychology, Richard Nisbett, he's the world's greatest authority on intelligence. And he tells us that our brain makes us easily susceptible to all sorts of influences. So watching a movie showing violent acts predisposes us to act violently. Even just listening to violent rhetoric makes us more inclined to be violent. What are we feeding ourselves? In what ways are we nourishing ourselves, our families, your marriages? It's all about the choices that we make. It's all about the realization that we are in control of what we put into our minds and our psyches and into our bodies. That we can choose not to feed our anger or jealousy or selfishness, that we can choose not to watch violence or even not to watch the humiliating humor that is so often found on our television sets. It's now pretty much a fact that 50% of marriages end in divorce. Might it be a question of nourishment? Might it be a question of what couples are feeding each other, the choices that are made? You know, I really believe that few couples realize that every single choice a couple makes in a marriage either builds the marriage up or tears it down. Every single choice, whether it's something very small or very large. Because marriage doesn't happen on the day of the wedding. It's something that's created every single day by the choices that are made for that marriage, how that marriage is nourished and fed. A woman went to seek counsel from a psychologist, and she confided to the psychologist that she hated her husband. And she said to the psychologist, "I want to hurt him all that I can." So the psychologist said to her, "Well, in that case," he said, "this is what I want you to do. I want you to start showering him with compliments. And when you have become indispensable to him, when he thinks you love him devotedly, that's when you start the divorce action. Because that's the way to really hurt him." So she left the counseling session, and months later she came back to tell the psychologist everything was going very well. And so the psychologist said, "Well, good, now it's time to start the divorce." And she said, "Divorce?" She says, "I love my husband very much." It's all about the choices we make. It's all about how we feed each other. It's all about how we nourish each other. Now, the craziness of our lifestyles today, and I think we have to admit they're pretty crazy, the craziness robs us of a lot of needed nourishment for peace, for happiness, for contentment. Just think of the countless hours that all of us, most of us, I presume, I certainly admitted that I do, the countless hours that we spend on our computers. Some 30 million people are now involved worldwide in online virtual reality video games. And there was a survey done by Stanford University of 30,000 of these gamers. And listen to these results. Nearly 40% of men and 53% of women who play online games with other people on the computer said that their virtual friends were equal to or better than their real-life friends. And more than a quarter of the gamers said that the emotional highlight of the past week occurred on the computer in their virtual world. It sounds to me more like starvation. It doesn't sound to me like it's very nourishing. But sometimes the greedy and the cruel and the selfish wolf does not win. We all know there are many wonderful examples of people who do feed the best parts of themselves. And it happens in all of our fields, but let's just take sports, for instance. It happens when a young basketball girl is brought in on crutches to score a layup, to break a record. It happened when a young gal playing baseball was carried around the field after she twisted her ankle. We have seen opponents in competitive sports transcend the competition because of relationships, because of something greater. There's a great story of two college golfers. They were vying for a spot in the national championship. Grant Weibark, a sophomore at the University of St. Francis, had locked up a spot in the Nationals with his team. But he was in a playoff against Olivet Nazarene's Seth Doran for individual honors. If he won or lost, he would still be going to the Nationals, but Seth needed to win in order to secure a spot. Well, what happened next is what movies are made of. Weibark stood over his tee shot on the first playoff hole. He looked down the fairway and back at his ball, and he hit it 40 yards right of the fairway, out of bounds for a mile. He made a double bogey. But Doran made par, and he gained a spot in the Nationals. What makes it so incredible? Well, Weibark did it intentionally. He did it intentionally because he said that he felt that Doran had earned a spot in the next round. He said, "We all know Seth very well. He's not only a good player, he's a great person. He's a senior. He's never been to the Nationals. Somehow, it just wasn't in my heart to try to knock him out." He said, "Some people were very surprised at me." He said, "But my team understood what I was trying to do. They were supportive of me. I felt that Seth deserved to go just as much as I did." It was one of those things where I couldn't feel good taking something from him like this. My goal from the start was to get to the Nationals with my team. I had already done that. There are two wolves living in my heart, and they are at war with each other. One is cruel, greedy, and selfish, and the other is wise, kind, and generous. And I need to be aware every day which one of these wolves that I'm feeding.